Alright, so this class is titled, What is Beautiful Art? And is there a purpose to which we seek it out? So this is it's a very provocative question, and it's a heated one, a controversial one, because how can you even make a statement like that? What is beautiful art? A lot of people are like, well, beauty, it's whatever I myself view to be beautiful. Everyone here is probably thinking of something different when they think first of, like, you hear the word beauty, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Everyone's going to be thinking about something different, most likely. You might agree on what another person says they find to be beautiful, but that's not necessarily the first thing that you're thinking about. And is there something that we can really say is in common with everyone's idea of beauty? Or is it really just, oh yeah, I've also looked at that, I agree that that's beautiful. So the point of this class is not to, set a standard of like what is beautiful art and say that everything that doesn't meet that standard is not going to be within that category. But it's more of if everybody seeks out beauty, just as Socrates makes up the point that everyone seeks out what is best for them. So if you don't understand your concept of beauty, it can be a somewhat troubling thing to think about as to, well, what is ultimately motivating what I'm drawn to? What is motivating my desires? What's motivating my thought process? I mean, a lot of people, you're drawn to beautiful things, but if you can't think of a purpose for it, then you're kind of just like drifting there, and you can't really have a purpose for why you're drawn to those things. So the point of this class is not to set rigid rules, but really to ask the question, is there a way to approach this that there can be some common ground for people to think about? The other question is there a purpose for why we're drawn to beautiful things? And if there is a purpose, that means that it's something that you can use reason to judge, which again is a controversial thing. So how do you address this question if there's seemingly no rules to what is beautiful? Well, Schiller makes the argument, and this class is going to be largely based on his letters to, what's the guy's name, Matt?
Kerner.
I always forget his name, because he doesn't speak in these letters. It's just Schiller's letters, so he's kind of forgettable. But Schiller makes the point that beauty is actually an objective thing. That's a pretty controversial statement, especially since at the time Kant was pretty much the most popular philosopher at that time, probably even more popular than Schiller. And Kant, whose thoughts still dominate how we think about beauty today, he made the point that beauty is an individual experience. It's a taste that you can only experience through an empirical phenomenon. So he would use the example, this rose is beautiful. I find this rose to be beautiful. But I can't make the statement that roses in general are beautiful because I have not seen every single rose. So since you haven't experienced every single rose, you're not allowed to make that statement. Maybe you'll find a rose that you don't find to be beautiful. And the empirical experience ultimately is subjected to our senses, which will differ from people to person, and thus you can say beauty becomes in the eye of the beholder. Schiller, on the other hand, he says, no, there's actually an objective approach that we can take to beauty. He agrees with Kant that experience confirms beauty. However, he adds that the experience itself is not necessary for its validity. So think about that for a second. What does he mean by this? experience is not necessary to validate beauty if beauty is from our senses, and we judge beauty from our senses. How can you judge beauty otherwise? So he makes the point that it isn't our taste, like Kant stated, that determines what is beautiful. Schiller's thought is that beauty is a form of a form, which one calls matter. And it must by all means to be a formed matter. So perfection is the form of matter. Beauty, on the other hand, is the form of this perfection, thus it being a form of a form. So perfection exists in an objective state. Beauty is something that we do use a certain, experience, sense experience from, but its condition is based on the perfection of the form of matter. So you can already kind of start thinking about how can beauty exist.
Sorry, just a quick question. When he says like the form, perfection is the form of matter, does he mean something like the sphere, the perfect sphere as an idea is the form that bubbles, like that spheres in matter, like bubbles, are organized around? Is that what he means? Like the transcendental idea?
Yeah, you can say that like a sphere, a perfect sphere is perfect in terms of its dimensions. Yeah. But then we look at the appearance of a bubble, for instance, and we take pleasure in seeing a perfect bubble, or what appears to be a perfect bubble, because we never get quite a perfect bubble
in the material world.
And so beauty is coming already from this idea of perfection. It's already made, its existence is based on a condition of the form of perfection. But it's not completely, aware of what it's doing, how we view it. So, in order to think about this, how to answer this more clearly in terms of how beauty can be objective, Schiller pretty much, that's his whole point of the Kalias or on the beautiful paper, is this question of, is beauty really an objective thing? So, don't be afraid. This is the only slide that looks like this. But before we go further, there's just a few terms that we need to kind of think how Schiller. Think of this as like an approach to a hypothesis. So right now Schiller is hypothesizing, and he starts his paper out this way, that beauty can be objective. And he's the only one to say this. Everyone else says that you have three other versions, which if I can remember, it's like objective, rational, then you have subjective, rational, and subjective, sensuous. But no one thinks that it's just like objective, sensuous, that's how Schiller words it. It's an objective sensuousness. So just really quick how Schiller is thinking about this. He breaks down conceiving appearances, which is what beauty is, right? It's an appearance of something. He breaks it down into two categories of observation and representation. So Schiller is saying that observation is when it directly goes to our cognition. So again, you can use the example of like the sphere, for instance, and you know that you're finding beauty in it because of something that it's representing that's higher than just the appearance of the beauty. Then you have the other category of representation, which is that you're contemplating it, and the representation can act upon you in a passive or an active way. So passively in that it's just kind of like you're receiving the impression of it, and actively in the sense that you're trying to put it into some form of reason. Then you have two forms of reason, theoretical and practical action. Theoretical, again, is the representation with cognition, and is further divided into intuition, which is an accidental thing, concepts which are necessary. What he means by accidental and necessary is that you can have an intuition that something is true, and you are you're basing it on your cognition, but it's not really a fully developed thing, and these things can come to you, but it's not that they necessarily have this, like, you know, they're not concrete yet. Whereas concepts, they're concrete, they're things that you've discovered to be true, they're necessary for your formation of reason. In the practical action domain, the representation is the will to action, and it's further divided into free action and not free action. So again, free action has more of a consciousness to it, and thus it's free, and a not free action. So Schiller makes the point that it's the reason that gives the combination, the ability for the combination. So your senses give you what he terms the manifold. So you're receiving all of these like appearances, all of this like, all of this sensory data, but it's reason that gives things combinations so that you can actually make some kind of sense out of it. And one other thing is that Schiller goes on to conclude that beauty does not lie in the domain of the theoretical reason, but in the practical action domain. Since beauty is independent of concepts, as he defines it here, and relies on appearance, and yet it must be sought reliably still in the family of reason. Therefore, he concludes, it can only be found in practical action. And he adds that there's no disgrace in this to beauty.
So he means like you can't get a definition of beauty as a concept definition, but you can only get it in its effects?
Well, this is the thing, is that like when you're thinking of a concept, don't think of it as like an impression. Because he's using concept in a very defined way here, where it's like concept is like kind of a discovered reality. Whereas, you know, beauty is often about appearance, about impression. So it's not a fully, like you cannot write a complete proof of why you think something is beautiful, like through data, right? It doesn't belong in that domain of the theoretical reasoning, but it still belongs in the domain of reason, and that's the important thing. And again, it's looking heavy now, but it's gonna get lighter later on. We just have to form a basis for how we're gonna approach our hypothesis to beauty in order to look at the examples and then judge them whether they are beautiful with this standpoint that Schiller is introducing to us. Matt, do you want to read it?
Yeah, okay.
Read it? I'll read this one. From an action of the will, or moral action, it demands imperatively that it be through pure form of reason. From an effect of nature, it cannot demand, but wish that it be through itself. But wish that it be through itself, that is show autonomy.
That it show autonomy, sorry, that's a typo.
Oh, that it show autonomy. Pure self-determination overall is a form of practical reason. Pure self-determination overall is a form of practical reason. Therefore, if a being of reason acts, so must it act out of pure reason, if it shall show pure self-determination. If a mere being of nature acts, then must it act out of pure nature, if it shall show pure self-determination. For the self of the being of reason is reason. The self of a being of nature is nature. Okay, it means like lower living forms in nature.
Don't even think about
don't
lower.
Think about that. Okay.
Don't think of it as
all right. I'll throw that away. Now, if practical reason discovers in contemplation of a being of nature that it is determined through itself, it ascribes to the same similarity of freedom. However, because this freedom is merely lent to the object by reason, since nothing can be free except the supersensible, and freedom itself can never fall as such into the senses, since it is merely a matter than an object, since it is merely a matter that an object appear free, not actually is. So is the analogy of an object with the form of practical reason not freedom in action, rather merely freedom in appearance, autonomy in appearance.
Does anyone want to try to summarize what that meant? I know it's very heavy.
I could give an example, but I don't know if you have examples.
Well, it's not about examples so much as to like explain what is Schiller, how is Schiller categorizing these things?
Well, when he talks about a mere being of nature in opposition to a being of reason.
Okay.
I know it may sound weird, but is it that he's talking about beasts?
Well, I would not think about it in terms of how we're used to hearing about things, but really just take it from like directly how Schiller is talking about it. And that's why it's important that we define some of the words, the definitions already, because Schiller has a different idea when he uses some of these words, like practical reason. If I were to just say practical reason to you, you know what we would think.
The first one he says, from an action of the will or moral action, it demands imperatively that it be through pure form of reason. From an effect of nature, it can but wish that it be brought through itself. That is, show autonomy.
Yeah.
So, well, first from an action of the will, so something human, or like necessarily requires a human being for the will, or moral action, it demands imperatively that it be through pure form of reason. So if you will something and you take a certain action, it has to be completely from yourself, like self-moved. You know, if you're doing something because somebody shamed you and said, you should do the right thing, and so therefore you will to do the right thing, well, that doesn't count. Because it's not issuing forth just from yourself. It's not a pure, it's not from pure reason. So from effect of nature, it can but wish that it be brought through itself.
It has to be completely your own will.
Yeah.
So this already
That it
seems
shows
to be
autonomy.
a bit of like a contradiction, because he just said that beauty lies in the domain of practical action.
Yeah, and that's what he says there.
So we want to like not to answer all of this right away, because it's a lot to think about, but to already have that in mind, that there's a bit of what seems to be a contradiction. Hold on, I just want to elaborate a little bit, and then I'll take your question. So what he's differentiating here with action of the will is that it's not the same as practical action. It's not even a free action, because you can have free action in the state of a being of nature. So the action of the will is different in terms of just this idea of free action. And an action of the will is equivalent to moral action, and thus it is governed by pure form of reason. Whereas nature, you can say that, like, you know, my cat is like very much of this being of nature, right? Where he just does whatever he wants, and he's completely free, but he's not free on this level of reason. He's free in his being of nature. And you know, there's many other examples of this. So the differentiation between pure reason and pure nature needs to be very clear in people's minds, and that pure nature, the being of pure nature, can have a similarity to freedom, but is it ultimately free if it doesn't have an action of the will? So it's an appearance of freedom. When we look at something in nature, it has the appearance of freedom, but you can't quite say it is ultimately free, because it doesn't have that ability to really judge an alternate course, you know, to rearrange it if it's not the best course. And I think that that's actually something, you know, we should keep in mind when we're looking, when we let beauty act upon us. You could say that we're kind of like being more of a being of nature, whereas if you have an ability to receive beauty still, but you have more of this idea of, action of the will. This is just something to keep in mind. It's not to answer all of these questions right away.
Aaron.
Sorry, Aaron.
Right. Well, I think you kind of answered my question, but I was just going to point out that the appearance of freedom in like nature in itself being nature comes from the quality of reason, like the ability to be like if the nature is reason, if human nature is reason, our ability to see beauty in nature as nature is comes from our reason. Like without our reason, we would not be able to see that.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about how Schiller approaches this is that he lays the groundwork, but then later on, it seems he's almost contradicting it. But it's just that beauty, just in its raw form, is of the sensuous domain. There's still always reason there. You can't ever rid yourself completely of reason because we're thinking people.
Right.
But there is another way to think about it, which we won't address right away.
Also, reason is not logic either.
No.
It's not.
No, there's no understanding in beauty in its raw form. Does someone want to read that?
Agreement of an action with the form of the pure will is morality. Analogy of appearance with the form of the pure will, or freedom, is beauty in the broadest meaning. Therefore, beauty is nothing other than freedom in the appearance.
What do you guys think about that?
Agreement of an action with the form of the pure will is morality. Analogy of the appearance with the form of the pure will, or freedom, is beauty in the broadest meaning. Therefore, beauty is nothing other than freedom in the appearance.
So we already made the distinguishment between action of will, which just constantly remind yourself it's different from practical action. Action of will, which is pure will, is morality. Being a being of nature, which has a certain idea of freedom in it, is an analogy at best to freedom, because you're not ultimately, you don't really have a choice to alter your course. My cat cannot decide, this is kind of a selfish thing to do, or not a more base thing to do. I'm going to change my mind on it. But there's something about that nature of being that we find is beautiful because it's uninhibited. It's uninhibited, but not in like a degraded way.
No, it's nature.
Uninhibited in a way that we respect. Just like, we find dignity in certain animals like lions or like eagles, like certain animals that we find hold themselves with a certain amount of grace. It's that idea that this being is acting from its pure nature, which is free, and there's something that causes us to react to that, and we find it beautiful, and we can find it dignified. Okay. So Schiller uses this example. I think it's fitting as the first example we're going to determine as to what is beautiful and what is not beautiful. And so what Schiller does is he takes Baumgarten, which I've never heard of, but apparently he was a well-known philosopher during that time. And he's asking, which line would you find more beautiful? And before you answer, let's just ask that question first. Which line do you find more beautiful?
Top one.
Why do you think it's more beautiful than the bottom one?
Symmetrical.
The bottom one's symmetrical too.
Top one's free.
Well, no, look at the way it ends, where the I and the L.
Oh, sure. Okay, yeah, maybe.
Okay, so Baumgarten's view, which I think is worthy of us noting here, he says that the wavy line is beautiful because it is always changing its direction, thus is representing multiplicity, and always returns again to the same direction. thus representing unity. But then Schiller makes the point, if that were true, then the below example would be just as beautiful, which also represents multiplicity with the A to I,
Right.
and then the unity with the K to the L. I don't know why it skips the letter. So Schiller makes the point, the argument, that the second example is not as beautiful to us because its direction changes more abruptly, and the former is more unnoticeable. He says, nature loves no jump. If we see it make one, then we can see violence has been done onto it. The wavy line seems to have a voluntary movement to which one can assign no determined point in which it changed its direction. The wavy line is therefore distinguished from the latter by its degree of freedom. And just to note that wavy lines also occur in nature, which we do find beautiful. That's a flying snake, by the way.
Flying snake.
Those aren't
Yeah.
real.
Yeah, they are.
So a dragon.
Yes, they are.
Wait, what about
I have a picture to prove it.
what about shark teeth? They're in nature and they're jaggedy.
But they're not. They're not.
We don't find it beautiful, though.
No, we don't. We're something scary. Yeah, right. Good call.
Stick your hand in this beautiful valve.
So we're gonna now that we have this basis, we're gonna look at a few examples, and we're gonna be very honest as to how we feel about them. Okay, and they're gonna be in representations of twos. So you have this example of a sculpture. It's called Wood Sculpture of Naked Woman by Carlos Baez Barrueto. I don't know what year this was done. Have a very good look at this. I'm sure everyone's enjoying this. And then you have this one, which is called Diana the Huntress by Augusta St. Gaudens, which was done in 1922. So who wants, how do I, the arrows are like, okay. Who wants to take a gather as to, is there a difference between these two?
Well, they're both two naked
Let's
ladies.
first ask the question, does everyone find this beautiful?
Yes.
Sure.
Does everyone find this beautiful?
No.
Less.
Oh, less.
Still beautiful.
Okay. So, share your thoughts. Why is this one less beautiful than the other one?
Well, there's a different emphasis.
That's what I'm saying.
More harmony in the forms.
More harmony? How so?
Comme c'est plus esthétique.
How is there more harmony?
Well, you know here like she has some.
She's more
she has
manly.
part, yes.
Is she?
Although
That's
the
a
shoulders
female
are
form
bigger.
too, though. That's not a manly form. That's a female
Well,
form.
she has a less firm. Her waist compared to her
But it's
ses hanches, c'est plus droit.
right. Well, I think that one thing you want to maybe ask yourself too is that really like? I'm not saying that that's not a natural form, but are you saying that this form is not a natural form? Because you're saying that her waist is smaller. Let's be honest, guys.
Well-
You like the small waist, the big butt, the big boobs.
Well, maybe culturally.
Well, I guess this one's more indicative of somebody who's actually like an active person, like she's doing a
Muscle
typically
family.
man's thing, hunting. If you were constantly in a state of motion all the time, like
What do you
as a
think
hunter, you
about-
probably wouldn't have a body.
Well, here
That uniform
let's think
that
about
way.
this question a bit more differently. What do you think she's thinking about? And I know that that's not necessarily about beauty.
Pocahontas or
The
something.
flowers that she's looking at.
It's like
Well,
Pocahontas.
so I actually took a class on Greek sculpture, and the whole when a woman, or usually women have their heads down in sculpture, and what that represents is, in a sense, inferiority or being of a lower standing. And so obviously this statue over here, she is not with her head down, and she's a bow. So she's in a position of strength, and you know she's aiming it at something. There's a direction towards wherever she's pointing her arrow. The other one is just aimlessly walking around with her head down. There's no substance
Yeah,
necessarily.
you're not even sure if she's blocking or if she's just like.
Well, that one's very passive,
I think
Right.
that
and the other one is a lot more active and
Yes. That one's is submissive, and the other one is more aggressive.
But are they not
Well,
both
it's not
beautiful?
that necessary.
Are they not both beautiful though?
Well, this is the thing, is that they are both beautiful, but what is the qualitative difference? Let's say, is there such a thing as a qualitative difference in beauty?
Mhm.
Can you even put that out there? Because that's already very controversial in our society. Say something like that. Sorry, Dave has been calling me first.
Oh, well, I had another, but if the idea of the form, because we're talking about form, so if we're just looking at that, there's all sorts of observations, but in one form, there's an emphasis on, it's very voluptuous and very generous proportion. If you look at the second one, the form and the emphasis is not so much on the proportions of body or anything. Like there seems to be there's another idea of form that is evoked from the type of action that's been chosen.
Mm-hmm. I think. Oh, sorry. You had a point.
Well, I was going to say with the first one, I find it's more curvy, more waves. The light falls nicely. So that if you look at the light, the way the light falls, it's even rounded, like it's curved everywhere where the light is catching.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the second one, even the shadows are sharp. Like
Yeah, and also
it's
just to
sharp.
say that these two statues are actually in a different location.
Yeah, you can see that.
Oh, right, yeah, they were
Kind of
positioned
obvious.
at different parts of the museum.
And that's the thing too, we have to be somewhat forgiving sometimes
Yeah,
with the
right.
lighting of these sculptures because it's the pictures don't always offer like the most flattering lighting for if the sculptor had an idea, and often they do, of light in
But
it.
what I was going to
Yeah.
say is this one looks more, because of the lighting, the curves, it's more serene. It gives you a feeling of calm, of serenity.
This one?
No, the other one, the first one.
Okay.
Whereas this one is more action, more...
So then now the question is there a qualitative difference between, let's say, the action and the serenity? Is there something?
Well, yeah, we're not gonna just assume a conclusion to that, but
Yeah, but first, just the last sentence,
Yeah.
if you don't mind. The way I interpret it, honestly, is the first one is that the first woman is genetically more close to perfection.
Yeah.
But this is the
Genetic,
thing,
from
is
a
like,
genetic
how
point
are
of view.
you determining your idea of perfection? And not to answer that,
culturally ingrained.
yeah, not to answer that, okay? Like, don't just think about it. How is this perfection and this isn't perfection? Because you could say that this is more perfection in action. You can see that she is probably a good, she has a good shot with her. It's not, because like if you look at a male form, for instance, that's a lot of times what we're looking at with sculpture is an action and how the muscles are sculpted for action. So again, it's not to, like, I'm just going to make a few points here. So Diana, she is a hunting goddess, and she's associated with wild animals and woodlands. She also later became a moon goddess, supplanting Titan goddess Luna, and the goddess of childbirth and ruled over the countryside. So the main differences for me, first of all, I think that, the points of like just their position, this is a more passive position. We have to admit that. And the title of it is literally Naked Woman. Okay, so already, like, this is the idea. It's a naked woman.
And this
There
is
you
from
go.
when was this done?
It's more modern. I don't have the exact date, but you can say that it's been more recent.
I think on the internet it said like 1970s or something.
Okay. Whereas this one, it has already a story behind it, where she is the goddess of hunting. That's why it's not like supposed to be an aggressive thing.
Well, she's very
She's just a good hunter, yeah. In the first picture, her someone made the point, I think it was Erin, that she's more static. She's not really seemingly portraying any specific emotion, whereas Diana's body is in motion. Her attention is obviously the hunt. I'm going to stop going back and forth. I think everyone has it in their minds. When looking at the anonymous woman, we're purely enjoying her form and nothing else. Is that fair to say?
Yeah.
In Diana's case, we're not just seeing a naked woman, but there's a sense of her personality which is strong and sovereign. So looking at her, I feel, I don't know about you guys, I feel a sense of liberation, of freedom through her appearance of strength. That she's, that's actually, despite her being naked, she doesn't seem vulnerable.
No.
Right.
So thinking about what Schiller is talking about here, that beauty is freedom, and I think that the key point here, my mouse is slow, is, I think you made a good point with her head pointing downward. It's submission, like we're having beauty in a sense act upon us. Like when you're looking at this, what are you ultimately, like, how are you reacting to it versus the other one? Here, it's more like instinctive, desires or whatever are being invoked from you, whereas this one, you might actually, think about what this is representing a little bit more clearly. Like you're not governed by just this like raw emotion that just like kind of takes you over. Everyone who sees the voluptuous figure, you're almost blinded in a way with like, well, how am I thinking about this? I don't even know. Like I can't see past, all of that. So to just further reiterate, the definition of freedom is to be without outward influence and to be governed solely by inward influence or have the appearance of being governed by inward influence. So how would you say, using Schiller's hypothesis, which we haven't disproven yet, how would your approach be different, between those two sculptures? Can you say that using the question of freedom now, is there a difference?
Well, so if I were to say,
and I mean like nature too, right?
Right. So
like
if I were to say that,
of being yourself in nature, is she being herself?
So yeah, if I were to say that, I would, let's say, be more inclined to like this one because my understanding of what nature is for a woman is to be submissive. Is that where I'm getting my idea of beauty from?
Well, that's the question, right?
So in a sense, why would the other one be more beautiful? Is that something which is, like, is that a nature, a woman in strength, let's say, hunting, is that something that is intrinsic in nature?
Well, I think, and again, we're not going to like do any kind of firm answers with this. This is things for people to contemplate on. But when you think back to on the idea of like, well, beauty is a form of a form, and that beauty is ultimately a reaction to a form of perfection. And again, this isn't clear in this example, right? Like, well, is the voluptuous woman our idea of perfection, or is it the hunting goddess, which is an idea of perfection? I think that if we were to have a male example to this, we would pick the one with action, because our idea of a man
Hunting and
is different from that of a woman. So that's just like for you to think about. It's not to say, we're not going to impose anything, but that kind of already with this method of like thinking about it, you already discover, well, if I think the first one is more beautiful of a woman,
Why?
that might tell me something about how I think about the definition of woman. So Schiller makes a very interesting point. He says, who wants to read? Olivier? I know it's a bit hard to... Oh,
Yeah,
no,
you gotta get
actually
up closer.
Schiller's a bit-
In other words, the negative concept.
Dave, Olivier.
Just if you. Go ahead.
Thank you. In other words, the negative concept of freedom is only thinkable through the positive concept of its opposite. From this ground, in the world of sense, only the beautiful is a symbol of the completed in itself, or of the perfected, because it does not need to be related as the positive, purposive to something outside itself, but rather at the same time commands and obeys itself and carries out its own law. So soon as one discovers the ground of determination of its form, for then the same does indeed not lie in it, rather outside it. And it is just as little beautiful as an action from purpose is moral.
Anyone want to explain that in their own words? So keeping in mind, looking at these two sculptures, Schiller again is talking about how do you look upon something with an appearance of freedom? How are you determining that it has even an appearance of freedom if it doesn't actually have pure freedom? So he's saying that we don't actually have an idea of positive freedom. We have an idea of a negative concept of freedom, which means that we only have a positive concept of the opposite of freedom.
Like what?
Submission, right? An idea of submission, an idea of passivity,
Slavery.
is an opposite idea of freedom. So we can have a positive confirmation of the opposite of freedom. And therefore, that's how we look upon it as an act of freedom. Because what is a true act of freedom? You have to ultimately hear how the person is thinking, right?
Right, because even if the person is unshackled from their slavish chains physically, it doesn't mean that they're not slaves.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that that's...
So it has an appearance of it.
I would give the example, because the idea is it's like self-contained, right? If you think of like somebody, a farmer who's actually, tilling the fields or working in the fields, but is a free person, right? Is actually just harvesting nature versus a slave who's working in the same
Right, but you
field.
can have a painting of a farmer. Do you know if that farmer is ultimately being self-governed, that he owns that land, that he's doing this for the benefit?
That's the whole point of the form.
Yeah, you have an appearance of
It's
it.
the form that decides.
But another important point in this is that he's saying that not only can you have only a negative concept of freedom through appearance, but that in order for it to do this, we have to assume, we have to look upon it and say there's no outward governance to it. And if there's no outward governance to it that we can see, then we must assume there's inward governance. But there's still a rule. So it says, at the same time, commands and obeys itself and carries out its own law. In terms of, again, how we're viewing how it's being self-governed. As soon as you discover that there's something else determining it, then it loses its beauty, just as we can say a moral action loses its morality if we find out, well, that person just did that moral action because if they didn't do it, they were going to go to jail or they were going to be fined. Then it's less moral because there's an outward influence to it.
Right. So if we were to find out that she was actually being forced to hunt for
There's
some
a gun to
landlord,
her
or
head
yeah,
outside
that
the
would
frame.
reduce the beauty by
Right.
far of what
Right.
we're otherwise appreciating in that.
Yeah,
in that
forced to
sculpture.
be hunting naked.
Right. Yeah. She's got a stack of clothes in the ground behind her, and yeah,
But she's
exactly.
she's called after, she's named after Diana, which is the hunting goddess. So we can assume that
Right.
she makes up her own rules.
Right.
Did you have something to say about that?
Well, it seems that for Schiller, the aesthetical and moral judgments are really combined. Unlike Kant, because in his critique of the judgment, he says that the aesthetical and moral are distinct.
Well,
judgment are
if you
completely
take it,
separate. So
right, if you take the moral though and the aesthetical from just their raw forms, so aesthetical for everyone else, that's like the world of the sensual domain. It's governed by your senses. What Schiller does is he's trying to show a natural alliance between these things. It's not unnatural, it's not forced. Whereas every other philosopher, even Kant, who was making good points as to like what was wrong with some of the theories, that there were holes in them, ultimately he could only just impose morality by force. Whereas Schiller will later on show that it's something that can be natural.
But what seems contradictory is that he seems to be saying that beauty is free. Is the let's say
It's
the
an
expression
appearance
of
of freedom. It's an appearance
it's
of
somehow the
freedom.
expression of freedom.
It's an appearance of
But it
freedom,
is-
therefore it's a lower order of freedom because it's an appearance. But here, let's continue and then we'll see how this goes, okay? Because I'm also behind on time. So, just from this ground in the world of sense, only the beautiful is a symbol of the completed in itself, or of the perfected, because it does not need to be related as the purposive to something outside itself, but rather at the same time commands and obeys itself and carries out its own law. So this question of beauty and morality, we've already naturally been thinking about this. Keep that in mind. We're not going to answer it right away. But just to also note that Schiller makes the distinction between morality and beauty. Morality is the determination through pure reason. Beauty as a property of appearances is determination through pure nature. And so, when we're looking at art, we can't judge art by just this like standard of morality. Morality in the sense of morality being imposed upon the art. And then say, well, this is beautiful because it's obviously moral. That's not beauty, because as soon as you impose morality, it's contrary to its nature, then it's losing its beauty, because beauty is supposed to be an appearance of freedom. So you can't impose morality. It has to come about naturally. The question of when it comes about naturally is another question. Okay, so this is the next example, the pairs of examples we're going to be looking at. This is called Death and the Sculpture, Daniel Chester French, 1889. The next example we're going to be comparing it with is The Kiss of Death by, it's not clear, either Joma Barba or Joanne Fontbernat, which was done in 1930. Discuss between yourselves while I quickly take a picture.
Well, he looks like he's going to a very nasty place.
Oh,
Yeah. The look in the eyes of that skeletal angel are just not welcome at all.
Whereas
Yeah, I like that one.
he looks like he's like going willingly, you know. He's finished his life. He's done a good.
Well, he's
deed.
still in the
His
middle of
grace-
his work. He's not
grace.
finished his work yet, so I don't know how willing he is. It's
Yeah,
not like he's
working on the
enthusiastic. Huh?
stick. He's working on the stick. or something?
Yeah, just
Yeah, I'm thinking like Moses' brother almost.
Well, he looks.
he's definitely not afraid of.
Yeah, he looks kind of like a little worried because death is an uncertainty, but he doesn't like look like, you know, like this guy. Oh my god.
I mean, obviously, death is way more morbid. He's a skeleton.
okay, so what are your thoughts?
This to me reminds me a lot of like the bubonic plague.
Well, which one is more beautiful, or are they both beautiful?
Well, I would say this one's more beautiful because of how it's composed.
And how is it composed?
Well, they're both standing, which is putting them on an even playing field, which I particularly think is significant because it's not exposing or depicting death as being this kind of unwanted visitor. this kind of this mystery person or this mystery entity.
And
that
also to
comes
keep
in.
in mind too, their titles, right? One is Death and the Sculptor. The other one is The Kiss of Death. And so why do you think this one is not as beautiful as the other one?
I think the first one, they're both like ascending, whereas that one, he's going like, you know, like it's a
But
kiss on
isn't
top of the help. He's
Isn't
like,
it aesthetically pleasing?
no.
It's talent. There was obviously
Some
talent.
way.
Yeah.
You know, whoever sculpted this had talent, but
Here it looks like death is consuming the
Yeah.
man. And the other one, it looks like, you know, it's like they're taking a sort of journey together.
Well,
Wait, I would put it, because in the other one,
Mm-hmm.
if you think of the idea of will, because he's talking about a human being, right? So he talks about it being of reason, and you know, if you use reason, then necessarily there's a question of will. You have to will. You can't just be a being of reason and not have a will. You know, it's unlike animals.
Mm-hmm.
So the question of will here is not clear. Like the person looks like passed out, or you know, it's not even clear. You know, there's no idea of sovereignty that you can really identify with. You know, like he's just being snatched out of the air, you know, by a vulture, basically. You know, could be a beast. The other one, there's actually an idea of whether he's willing it or not. It doesn't seem like it's against his will. Right, there seems like there's something pushing beyond just a question of for or against.
Looks almost like
He's
a
like
dance.
reaching out to her.
But there is the idea of will and of the human. There's a human quality to it, which manages to come through.
Does anyone disagree?
Well, I was going to say that this one seems more of a rite of passage, so to speak. Like it's a transformation into this ascension that this character on the right is going to be ascending into. It makes it more harmonious and makes it seem a bit more pure in aesthetic, whereas the other one seems like death is being imposed on this character, which kind of takes away the rite of passage that death actually is. It's something that we own, but it's a transformation that we have to look forward to.
and I think like in the other one where the sculptor is sculpting the Sphinx. You know, that as a historical reference or relevance or something that again exists today, like we all know what the Sphinx is. So he's not just dying and withering away, that he's actually leaving behind something that is immortal in a sense.
Non-egotistical.
Very good, guys.
And
Also,
also
the first
this
one
one.
is, it's like the death is, it's like a human person. It like, rather than just thinking that a human being is what they are when they're alive, this is death as like a human being that had died previously, but it's still part of humanity. You know, so that rather than thinking there's a discontinuity, you're alive
Right.
and you're
Yeah.
dead. This death is like a skeleton; you're just no longer human.
Right. So you guys pretty much like went over the differences very well.
Wait, Christine?
Yeah.
One last thought here.
Well, this one too, if you look, it's like death has even stripped him of his clothes because the clothes are hanging on the hip of.
Actually, that's his rags. The rags of death that are covering
So
his
the guy's
private
completely
parts.
naked.
Yes. Okay.
Also,
Again, he looks stripped of.
He looks like he's been
semblance
stripped.
of
Yeah.
Sovereignty.
death is looking away. It's like he doesn't really care about that guy.
Right.
He's like, he's ready for his next victim. But the other death, she's like, you know, she thinks about the person. I'm sorry, your time is up. You're
She's
coming with me.
She has a bouquet of flowers too in her hand.
Yeah,
That's what I wanted.
she's more welcoming. The other one is like, I'm just doing my job here.
Yes. It's sort of like this gives you sort of a sense of without this kind of conception, how do you define a person as human? If you just sort of something that's alive, while biologically it's alive and you're dead, how is that human? But if there's death is something that people that have lived previously that you sort of
There's compassion there that there's not under.
Raphael, just speak out.
No, what I wanted to
These
say
people aren't going to raise
is
their
that
hands.
if
And
we
you're in the
wanted
back.
if we wanted to somehow deploy our moral judgment to appreciate beauty, definitely we would be inclined more to.
But we're not That's the thing. I'm not asking people to do a moral judgment. I'm asking people to be just completely honest in what they think is beautiful, and because let's be honest, guys. In our culture, we see stuff like this all the time, and people are attracted to it. So why is that happening? So again, it's always, even though beauty acts upon us through appearance, Schiller makes the point that beauty is objective, and beauty is still in the domain of reason, even though it acts in this domain of appearance. So we still have the ability to judge why we're attracted to certain things.
I can still say this is beautiful.
A lot of people, okay, in our culture right now would argue that this is beautiful. And like one thing I want to add between the difference between them, although I think you guys did a very good job, a very, very good job, is that this person is squatting over him like an animal. I think it was, that point was somewhat made. And if you look at his face, like in certain angles, if you didn't see his face, the death's face straight on, it would look kind of like a kiss. But as soon as you see his face straight on, it's like, that's not a kiss, that's like sucking the life out of him. And the man is just like, it's like almost a Dracula picture, right? Like the guy's just like kind of like that. There's nothing there left of him. Whereas in the other one, the man is able to confront death with him still being himself.
Yeah. There's no dignity in the second one.
No, and
doesn't
also
exist
ultimately sorry, there's a delay with the mouse. This one makes you fear death. That death is ultimately a perversity to life. What is the meaning of life if we all have to die and that's what we confront? Whereas this one, I didn't read I don't know if there's an explanation to this, and to be fair, like I didn't read the explanations to the first, all of the examples we've looked at so far. What I look at with this one, and the fact that she is holding a bouquet of flowers is very odd for death. Why is she holding flowers which represent life? He's in the middle of his artwork, and she gently is intervening upon him. And it's not clear if she's intervening upon him that she's going to take him in that moment, or if she's gently reminding him of her presence. So you can make the hypothesis with this sculpture that he's being reminded that death is there, and that you made the very good point, Aaron, that he's working on the Sphinx, which we look at as a very historical figure. So it's like the artist that is meeting his mortality, but is in the process of making something that is everlasting. What did you want to say?
I just want to say that even the flowers are a representation of this inevitable death, because flowers die, and even during their life they're beautiful, and they bring beautiful sentiment.
I don't have an answer for this, but why is death holding them, right? So in that sense too, like her coming up to him with these flowers, for me this does not look like she's calling upon him in that
right
moment.
Now. Yeah, it's like your time is.
I wanted to also make a point that this is a sculpture in a cemetery in Barcelona. Can you imagine, like, people are, they have to visit their loved ones who've passed away, and you have a sculpture like this representing what is death, which ultimately is how we're thinking about the point in life, is very much dependent upon how do you view death. Because if you view death as a perversity, do you really think about immortality? Is immortality possible? Or is it just all a cruel joke? So just to...
There's no value to life.
Yeah.
There's no compassion.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's a menacing thing to see when you're mourning someone's passing away.
No, it's just that I'm still not understanding is Schiller trying to explain to us that beauty is somehow an inherent quality of the object under contemplation? Like it's already...
We'll just take it step by step, because this is like an extremely heavy subject, and it's not, like, don't expect that you're going to have some overall conclusion of, like, you know, the facts after this.
I'm fine with
Can I
that,
say
but
something?
you said that it's subjective, right? At a certain point, you said it's like, there's something
beauty
of
is,
subjectivity.
I think that what we need to remind ourselves is that beauty is in the domain of appearances, that it's in the domain of practical action in reason, but it's also an appearance of freedom. So, like, again, these are hypotheses that Schiller is putting out that we have to be thinking of. We haven't necessarily proven that that's true.
I'm okay with that, but at a certain time, at a certain point, he talks about the self, what was it, like
Determination?
Somehow, every one of us should deploy his internal moral law. Let's say it abides to a certain internal moral law.
Yeah,
right?
but right now, so far with how we've defined morality and beauty, there are two different domains. So the question is, that we have to keep it in the back of our minds, because that's not the ultimate question we're trying to address right now. There are many questions, but like morality he determined as pure reason, beauty as pure nature. That's them in their most raw form. It's not like that's everything that beauty is, but that's them in their most raw form. Before I take any more questions, I just want to add, so Kant, in his critiques of judgment, again, this is something that a lot of people find them saying the same thing today. He provided a thesis in his critiques of judgment, which says that nature is beautiful when it appears as art. Art is beautiful when it appears as nature. So you can make the argument, well, isn't death a cruel joke on life? Does anyone really want to die? Isn't death, like anyone who's seen people die, is it really something noble? Is it really something dignified? Isn't this a more true representation of what death is? What Schiller makes the point of is that, and Kant, that's the other thing, is that if you look at death as something like this, which is a cruel joke and it's a perversity, then you ultimately can't say that anything is truly free, because everything ultimately is subjected to death, which is an unwilling thing.
But still has the appearance of freedom.
Hmm?
It still has the appearance of freedom.
Yeah, you could say, I mean, let's just keep that in mind. So, how can we be governed by an idea of perfection and freedom that we freely choose without burden in our life? How do we govern ourselves in life if we ultimately all die without choice? Now, I'm not going to try to go into that right now. That's kind of like that's the hypothesis of this sculpture. And Schiller has the famous quote, "No man must."
Mm-hmm.
That is, that all other things must, but man is the being who wills it to be so. And so keeping that in mind for the sculpture, bring in the camera.
I'm only getting half your face.
Huh?
I'm only getting half your
From the
face.
angle of the camera.
Yeah, now I can see you.
That in this one, there is a contemplation of, if you have a concept of immortality, then death doesn't really hold as much weight on you. It's not an easy thing to have, like, we're not going to have a concrete answer to that, but it's something to keep in mind. Who wants to read this one?
And the naturally beautiful we see with our eyes, that it is from itself, that it be through a rule, the sense does not speak to us, but rather the understanding. Now, however, the rule is related to nature as compulsion is to freedom. Since we now merely think of the rule, but see nature, so we think of compulsion and see freedom. The understanding expects and demands a rule. The sense teaches that the thing is through itself and through no rule.
And again, just as a disclaimer, this is all from Kalias or On the Beautiful by Schiller. So, does anyone want to try to summarize that in their own words?
So, this is what I was going to mention a little bit before, was that I think what Schiller's getting at here is that when we're viewing something that is just nature, or something that just exists and that is not, that maybe has the appearance of freedom but doesn't actually will. Where we find beauty in these things is in its appearance of freedom through its own nature. And then through human beings being, our nature being reason, this is where we see beauty in the things we create.
But can we really say that our nature is reason? Because why are we in a culture that we're in right now if our nature
right,
is reason?
So I guess the answer, not the direct answer or the empirical answer, but an answer could be that our culture is in itself not living by its nature. Yeah, it's not being natural.
Or it's living through one form. Like, this is the thing, right? Is that Schiller is talking about morality. Like, often, this is the whole point of everything that Schiller composes. Poetry, his plays, and his papers is how do you unite morality with nature? And he even says something in his paper along the lines that he views nature as nature in itself as something higher than like any of the rules.
Yeah.
So it's not to say that nature is just this lowly form that we need to tame and domesticate. That's the problem of the Kantian approach, is that it's ultimately you're imposing a force upon something that is supposed to be a representation of freedom,
right,
even though it's not completely. And there's a lot of psychology in this, because it's not full freedom, but it is still representative of freedom. Yeah.
I guess in thinking about both what you said and what Aaron just said, because Aaron, I guess, was also implying that the human compulsion should be in our nature to think. Like, that should be, just like birds fly, they're compelled to fly. There's no rule that say they have to fly, but their compulsion is to fly.
Which is why beauty ultimately still is in the domain of reason, but it's a different reason.
Yeah, it's a different beauty, too.
Yeah. So, in terms of this quote in particular, though, what is he saying? He's saying that this rule, the naturally beautiful actually has a rule. And again, think about how his hypothesis is that beauty is an objective principle. There is a rule, because what are we talking about all of a sudden? We're not just talking about willy-nilly senses, where we're using a rule in terms of the most general rule being it's a representation of freedom or an appearance of freedom. But our sense does not speak this to us. It is our understanding. The rule is related to nature as compulsion is to freedom. So when we think of the rule, when we see nature. So when you're seeing nature, you are thinking of a rule, but you're not thinking of it consciously, you can say. There's something that you're reacting to, and again, if you look at beauty as in a form of a form, which is perfection, that's a rule. Perfection is a rule. But you're not seeing that when you're looking at beauty in its perfection. And then you see compulsion is freedom, so it's a reverse, where you're using now the cognitive, the compulsion for morality is actually an act of freedom.
Well,
it's not something you're forced to do. And so where
it's ironic though. Sorry.
It is ironic.
Because usually people think of compulsion and they think of something devoid of free will. It's like
Right,
you're impelled to do it outside your free will.
They're both
but
they're-
is different.
Well, not ironic, but they're both paradoxical. Where like you're saying there's a rule and there's nature. That's contradictory so far with how we've been explaining things. And compulsion is freedom, because you have these two domains that are acting upon each other, and which one's going to win out? Is it really a battle between these two domains, or can you have a harmonious union with them? So he makes the point that where understanding, which is cognition, expects and demands a rule, the sense teaches that the thing is through itself and through no rule. But it does have a rule. But we consider it its being of nature. Again, just keep that in mind. You don't have to have like a whole detailed answer. So in this is the last example between two things. We're going to look at this one completely first, and then the next one completely. This one's called Psyche, Revived by Cupid's Kiss by Antonio Canova in 1787. This is regarded as a masterpiece of neoclassical sculpture and shows the mythological lovers at a moment of great emotion, characteristic of the emerging movement of Romanticism. It represents the god Cupid in the height of love and tenderness, immediately after awakening the lifeless Psyche with a kiss. The story of Cupid and Psyche is taken from Lucius Apuleius's Latin novel, The Golden Ass, and was popular in art. So the story goes that Psyche has been warned by Venus against opening the jar she was given to collect a scrap of beauty from Proserpina for Venus. But I give you one especially strong warning. Do not open or peep into the jar you carry, and repress all curiosity as to the imprisoned treasure of divine beauty. But she gave way to curiosity, just as she had returned from her voyage into the underworld, peering into the jar to take beauty, but rather with the sleep of innermost to take some of the divine beauty for herself. However, Proserpina had not filled it with beauty, but rather with the sleep of the innermost darkness, the night of Styx, which, freed from its cell, rushed upon her and penetrated her whole body with a heavy cloud of unconsciousness and enfolded her where she lay. It is the moment in which Psyche is a corpse asleep, revived by Cupid, that Canova chose to depict, delicately purging her of her sleep, which he put back in its original jar. He roused Psyche with a prick of his arrow, and in the sculpture you have like details of the jar and the arrow, blah blah blah. So what do people think about this, with the theme being love? Like the first theme was just like, the naked female form, what is beautiful, the naked female form. The second one was on death. This one's on love.
I mean, it's uplifting. Like love is very literally lifting this person out of a dark, deep sleep from death, essentially.
Well, love, beauty, and death perhaps are related as well.
Well, just look at this one in terms of like how do people feel about this being a representation of love?
Well, just like in the other one, like she's naked, she's stripped as well.
Well, that doesn't mean. I mean, we had the example of Diana, which had a very different effect from the other person. Like just the person being naked.
Right, and so what I'm saying is that the nakedness, her being stripped, is not the same as the other one in the sense that this is a more uplifting, like she is being freed from something.
Okay.
For me, it's more a depiction of desire than love. For me, Cupid, he gets struck by his arrows and suddenly, like, Well, for me, that is more desire than love. For me, love is more like understanding. It takes a while. It's not just like you take an arrow and there you go. And love. So,
But is he just shooting her with an arrow, or is he
no, just the fact that Cupid is in there, and the way the position also for me
It's pretty erotic.
is pretty erotic. It's more of desire than love. For me, it's a perverse.
The way he catches her. Oh,
It's romantic. It's a romantic.
It's romantic, indeed. Yes, he's.
Because you could
The
argue.
question is, well, what's wrong with romanticism?
You could argue that in a sense, though, you have like Cupid is like the personified idea of love, which is intervening. So you have like a higher
And also-
idea of natural law that's coming into.
Review the story too, right? Like, she was opening a jar that she thought she was going to get a piece of divine beauty, and instead she gets the sleep of innermost darkness. Is there something being said in that?
Huh.
It's her own. It was her own. It was her own
What
demise.
is divine beauty?
Right. So her own innermost darkness is the reality that she thinks she lacks that divine beauty.
And how was she awakened, right? She was awakened by a prick of Cupid's arrow, which sounds, dirty to me.
I wasn't thinking about it.
Sure, you're so pure. Well, this is the thing. Again, this is beautiful. I don't think anyone would say that it's not beautiful. Again, it's approaching it from like, well, what are we being governed by when we are reacting to it being beautiful? So some of the points that I want to make with this is what Schiller is saying, not directly about this. If we take objects merely as they appear, it removes purposes to them, since purposes is a concept. Therefore, the real ground for the possibility of an object never enters the realm of the senses and is good as not there. So here's another paradox, right? If beauty is really of appearance, how can you assert a purpose for
Repeat
it?
that. Repeat your question.
If we take objects merely as they appear, which is what we've been defining beauty as so far, but their appearance of freedom, right? If we take them merely as they appear, it removes purpose to them, since purpose is a concept.
Right. For a
Therefore,
process.
the real ground for the possibility of an object, the real ground for the possibility, the purpose of an object, never enters into the realm of the senses and is as good as not there. That's pretty much what romanticism is. You're not supposed to judge what the purpose is, like you just let your senses act upon you. A form therefore appears free, so soon we find the ground of the same neither outside it, nor are led to seek outside it. I would keep that in mind. Is she free? In this whole story, and the story was meant to be pretty much like the front line of the sculpture. Is she free?
No.
In that story. An object is freely presented in the intuition, which remember is that's the accidental form of appearances, if the form of the same does not necessitate the reflecting understanding to search for a ground. Beautiful, therefore, is a form which explains itself, but without concept. A triangle explains itself by means of a concept. A wavy line explains itself without the medium of the concept. So this is a challenge to people. So before we answer, is this the kind of beauty that we're looking for? Well, I forgot that I had that. Do I want to read that? Sure, why not? Who wants to read?
However, nothing in nature nor in art is truly free of purposes and rules. None is determined through itself as soon as we reflect upon it. Each is there through another. Each is there for another's sake. None has autonomy. The single existing thing that determines itself and is because of itself, one must seek outside of appearance and into the intelligible world. However, beauty dwells only in the field of appearances, and there is therefore no hope at all, by means of merely theoretical reason and upon the path of reflection, to come upon freedom in the world of sense. Clearly, the power which the practical reason exercises in the moral determination of the will against our instincts has something offending, something discerning, or distressing, in the appearance. We wish to see compulsion nowhere at all, not only when reason itself exercises it, but we also wish that the freedom of nature be respected, because we consider every being in the aesthetical judgment as a self-aim, and it disgusts us to whom freedom is the highest, and that something should be sacrificed to the other and serve as means. For that reason, a moral action can never be beautiful. If we look on the operation whereby it is frightened away from sensuousness. Our sensuous nature must therefore appear free in the moral, although it is really not. And it must have the appearance as if nature merely carried out the instructions of our instincts, in which they bow down, directly opposed to the instincts, beneath the dominion of the pure will.
So, he raises this issue of, c'est un peu comme contradictoire parce que c'est le conflit entre la subjectivité et l'objectivité en ce sens que il dit au début it is nothing in nature nor in art is truly free of purposes and rules, etc. So ce qui veut dire que when we appreciate beauty, we always have to rely on the purpose of the object under
you can
contemplation.
think about it this
first.
way. You can say that when you're looking at something beautiful, you're more reacting to something than thinking about something. So there's already two types of beauty there. Because I would hope, all of us have experienced the other form where you're thinking about why something is beautiful. That it's acting more on intelligibility of it. So it's not that morality and beauty are opposites that cannot naturally unite, but that it's the reason that unites both of them. And that's something that people have to think about. It's not something that can just be enforced through a definition. But in terms of the summary of this, we already agreed that nature is not actually free. It's an appearance of freedom because it does not have the act of the will. Because in order to have the act of the will, you have to be conscious of everything in terms of what are your options in order to decide this particular will, right? So for something to appear free is different from true freedom, which is a conscious will of self-determination. So what he's saying here is that it's to remind us that beauty is not completely an illusion, but it's not based completely in reality. It's appearances. Appearances is not reality. So we have to be aware of what's being played upon us right now. That an appearance of freedom ultimately is not free, and that everything exists with purposes, with rules,
which are not they're not located in the domain of
and nothing has complete autonomy, right? If we were to say everything were free in the world, how could we have a world that was nothing but chaos? Like you have to have some kind of boundary in what you inflict as your free will, and it's not something unnatural. That's the point. Is that it's, and we're going to go into that a little bit further.
I think maybe this is what you're trying to figure out, is that in the appearance of freedom of something beautiful. Something which is beautiful, which it being beautiful has to appear free. The reality is that nothing is actually free, either nature or art. These things are all set by some sort of rules, some sort of parameters. But when something appears to be free, that is what you as, again, I'm going to get back to the being of reason. Maybe I'm not getting at this the right way, but the being of reason will then derive beauty from that thing because it appears to retain that quality of freedom.
I think he says it clearly. We can't talk too much because it's already going a little too far into it, but the single existing thing that determines itself and is because of itself, we actually have, this is the idea of freedom, right? The thing that determines itself, that's the definition of freedom, is that it's an inward determination, not an outward determination upon it. In order for us to know that, which is what we already spoke about before, you ultimately have to have, you must seek an outside of the appearance into the intelligible world. You have to seek into reason. So like the example of a farmer is a good one, actually. The painting of a farmer, is this farmer a free person or not? In order for you to think, when you're looking at this farmer harvesting his crop as a free person, you ultimately have to think of a storyline outside of the farmer to think of him as a free person. So there is a paradox, and he knows that there's a paradox. That's the point, is that there is a paradox. But it's not an unnatural union once you start looking into the paradox with reason. So, just to reiterate his last point, that our instincts, nature, it projects our instincts as free, but they ultimately do bow down, actually directly opposed to instincts beneath the dominion of pure will. Let's keep that there for just a second. We're going to look at this example. Again, this is an example of love. It's called Nydia, The Blind Girl of Pompeii by Randolph Rogers, and it was done in 1853-54. The story with this is that Nydia, who is blind, she was in love with another man in Pompeii, but he rejects her. He ultimately chooses another girl. Because she's blind, her senses are heightened in terms of her being able to hear, which you're seeing here. She knows that the volcano is going to erupt before anyone else, and she chooses to save her love, not her lover, her love, and his lover to safety, and she actually dies in the process of saving them.
Where this was at the Met.
Yeah.
This is also at the Museum of Fine Arts, at the Pompeii exhibit.
Yes.
Yeah, there's multiple sculptures of this. So what do you guys think about this compared to the other one?
Well, it doesn't really seem to be illustrating only the idea or the purpose behind the object of that. It doesn't seem to be illustrating this idea you're talking about, that you want to save her love.
But that's the whole thing, is that there's a story behind it.
Yeah,
There's
because
a
we know
story
the
behind the
purpose
other
of
one
this.
too, by the way. There's a story behind
Right.
the other one as well.
Fine, but we're talking about art here, beauty in the context of art. Whereas Schiller wrote, I think, all that in his aesthetical language, right? It wasn't talking about art or
Okay, no, this is Kalias on the beautiful.
Yes.
Not
So
these
what I mean is that, well, here talking about a piece of art, we have to take into consideration the purpose of the person who made this piece of art. So if you're saying that his purpose
Well,
was
the
to
purpose
show
of
that
the portrayal, right?
Exactly. It doesn't illustrate the idea. The
It
purpose.
No,
You see, so I don't know if
because
it's
she's in
really
pain.
free as such. I have a problem with the word free.
Where is it from?
Well, this is the thing where like pictures again can kind of like do disservice.
That's exactly it. That she's not.
But
I know, but it looks like it doesn't
the
look like
sculpturing of this is actually, depending on how the light hits it, it can change how you're looking at it. And the marble is very thin for her drapes that you can actually like see through. It's a very delicate looking sculpture, which with a picture it might not necessarily show that delicateness. Does anyone else want to have a gather as to how they think about this compared to the other one?
I mean, we did see it in person, and we spoke about it a lot in person when we were at the Met. Where I disagree with Raphael is that when you look at, like, if you, I mean, obviously in person it's a totally different experience. But when you're there, it's not a very big sculpture. It's not something that's very grand and you know, like in your face and majestic, right? And I think that quality is what makes it so beautiful. Is that this story of this girl, of this blind girl, is not a majestic story. It's not a very happy story necessarily. And in itself, it shows, because the statue is so delicate, because the statue is the way it is, that in itself, and again, like in this appearance, that regardless of what was going around at the time for this girl, like she was still determined, even though she was blind, even though the city was burning and people were dying around her, and she eventually died. It didn't stop her from blindly moving forward. And even in the statue, in this representation, you know, the statue itself is delicate. It's
but
not.
you see here, you're relying on your moral internal interpretation.
No, but here, Raphael,
It's your moral judgment.
Hold on. What I would say is that love. You're noted that you've got a question. What is our definition of love without a moral judgment? Love. I mean, because you have to have some idea of love without just inflicting a moral rigidity to it. But love means that I would think you're willing to make sacrifices, compromises for that person. That's what love is.
You love yourself.
Yeah, I
you
don't think
indulge
that's what
in food.
he's just saying that this one seems to betray the idea that it's
Right,
supposed to
but
be.
let me just finish my sentence. So with the previous one, this love, it's sleeping, you know, it's like a sleeping beauty. She's awoken by Cupid, and it's a very, like, you know, romantic, you know, gesture of her being awakened, which in the sense of reason, like there's no reason in this, like she's awoken by Cupid's arrow. So it's just a nice picture, but like, what is their life after this? Where is the actual love? You have to assume that love in this is eros.
Like you're
right.
Reading the symposium after this, you're gonna see very quickly that this is the absolute representation of love.
Well, okay. So hold on. So in Nydia's case,
so it's more free.
Well, okay. Sorry, Dave. Yeah.
Well, the other thing I wanted to volunteer was that, you know, like for example, somebody in another culture, let's say, you know, or they come from another planet, let's say. I'm not implying anything, but people know about angels and know about Cupid, so it's easier to intuit what the background is for the first one. For this one, it's less obvious, but anybody who's going to look at this, you're going to be able to observe certain, you know, self-evident things. Like obviously she's using her hearing versus her sight, right? And obviously she's responding to something which is further away, or which is not within her direct sphere of action. And so naturally the first thing that anybody who sees this is going to say is, well, what's she listening to, or what's she listening for? So the question of the story becomes just natural, you know, second nature. There's nothing in there that betrays the intention of what it's really depicted. Yeah. So it's just a kind of natural, you may have to know more about the story, but in of itself, it's perfect the way it is, and it's not like it's requiring any alteration.
Hold on, like, we can't like talk too much, like, but the thing that we have to keep in mind is that if freedom is ultimately a sense of self-determination, it is a desire for self-determination. It's an appearance for self-determination. If you look at all of the examples we've looked at so far, we're leaning towards sculptures that have more of a mode of action. Because what did we just say before? The appearance of freedom, we can't ultimately say something is free through a positive sense. It's through a negative conclusion of freedom. So she does not look like she's being controlled by any kind of outside will. Whereas the other one, she's completely in the embrace of Cupid. And all of like the death picture too. Death is gently intervening on the sculptor, whereas the other one, the man is completely passive when death comes to him.
Yeah.
And the first example with the woman, she's again passive in her sexuality. She's just sexual for the sake of her sexual, physique. And the other one is again a form of action. So what Schiller says is that thence comes it that the moral purposiveness of an artwork, or even of a mode of action, contributes so little to the beauty of the same that the former must rather be very concealed and appear from the nature of the thing completely free and unrestrained, if the latter beauty shall not thereby be lost. If you're going to have morality in art, the morality cannot look like it's dictating the nature or the direction of the art piece, but rather is an action of free will of the art piece. So he says, practical reason demands self-determination. Self-determination of the rational is pure determination of reason, morality. Self-determination of the sensuous is pure determination of nature, beauty. Nonetheless, the concept of beauty is also applied in a different sense to the moral. And this application is nothing less than empty. So now Schiller is starting to get to the point of like, how does beauty and morality really overlap? Although beauty only adheres to the appearance, so is moral beauty nonetheless a concept. There is such a thing as moral beauty, to which something in experience corresponds. We can actually have a sense, perception, experience of moral beauty. It's not just relying on the domain of cognition. Nydia has helped without being called upon it and without debate with herself, although it was at her expense. She has forgotten herself so fully and her duty fulfilled with such easiness as if merely instinct acted from her. Therefore, were a moral action then first a beautiful action if it appears as an effect of nature arising from itself. In a word, a free action is a beautiful action when the autonomy of the disposition and the autonomy in the appearance coincide. So I took this example of love between individuals because it's a harder one. If we were to say love between a father and a child, then we would say no doubt. That's love. A father sacrificing his life for his child without thinking about it, that's what love is. But that doesn't come so readily to our minds when we think of love with like another person. So Schiller makes the point, from this ground is the maximum of the character perfection of a man as moral beauty, for it arises only then when duty has become nature to him. Does someone want to read that?
You want to read it? You haven't read it?
Good is a mode of teaching where one advances from the known to the unknown. Beautiful is it when it is Socratic, i.e., when it asks the same truth from within the head and the heart of the listener. With the first, goodness, its convictions are demanded from the understanding formally. With the second, beauty, they are enticed from it, the representation of which by all means compels us to bring forth the idea of freedom in ourselves and to relate to the object.
So that's pretty much how you align morality and beauty. He's saying that goodness is a mode of teaching that teaches us something with the mode of cognition. Beauty is something which it acts upon our head and our heart. Goodness you can demand upon someone, but beauty entices the goodness from you. So when you see something beautiful, like we've all watched movies, right? Let's get out of the sculpture realm. We've all watched movies where someone has made a sacrifice, and we've cried during the movie, and we're completely moved by the act of sacrifice. Why are we moved by that act of sacrifice? Nobody wants to sacrifice themselves. No one wants to cut their life shorter than it is. We're moved by someone acting
Selflessly.
yeah, it's an instinctive reaction to intervene upon something that ultimately is more oppressive to the whole than it is to themselves. And that's why it's beautiful. And so beauty, when we look at beauty in a higher level, it compels us for goodness. It doesn't demand it of us. We look upon it and we're moved by it. And we're like, I want that. I want that kind of portrayal of myself. So this is the second last slide. Does someone want to read it? Susan? Susan, you read it.
No, it's too far. I can't see it. Maybe Martin.
In respect to any great composition, it is necessary that the individual be limited in order to let the whole take effect. But this limitation of the individual at the same time be an effect of its freedom. Example, if its setless limit itself in the composition is beautiful. Beauty is through itself, subdued power, limitation out of power. In short, each individual desires to have its will, where, however, remains now the harmony of the whole when each concerns itself for only itself. Just therefrom does it follow that each out of inner freedom directly prescribes itself the limitation which the other needs in order to express its freedom.
So, again, this is reiterating what we just said, is that when we look at a sacrifice, a self-sacrifice as a beautiful act, it's ultimately for the freedom of a larger process outside of themselves. So that nothing is ultimately free. That's another point that we made. Otherwise we would have chaos. But when you set the limit upon yourself willingly, it can still be considered an act of beauty and of freedom. So beauty, Schiller's stating, is actually, in that sense, subdued power, limitation of power. And it's not passivity of power, it's a will to have that boundary for a larger whole. And that's what beauty is. The harmony of the whole when each concerns, how can you have the harmony of the whole when each concerns itself for itself?
That's very interesting because in British law, their idea of freedom is that you have the freedom to do whatever you want as long as it doesn't infringe upon the freedom to do of somebody else to do whatever they want.
Which is ultimately setting a boundary condition on you, but it's not a willing.
Exactly. Yeah. It's not from within.
It's
It's
not a
this
voluntary-
imposed
yeah.
thing from outside of yourself.
Right.
This is totally different. It takes something that looks very
And
similar.
it's possible.
Yeah.
You have to think, like, that's the thing, is that it doesn't just come naturally to you, but it can be a natural thing if you work through how your mind is thinking about it. Because your mind ultimately is a thing governed by reason. And I'm going to skip this because I think we've been on too much, but that's the final thing I want us to leave off what Schiller says.
For this reason, the realm of taste is a realm of freedom. The beautiful world of sense is the happiest symbol. How the moral one shall be, and every beautiful natural being outside of me is a happy citizen who calls out to me, be free as I.
So he's saying that ultimately we are drawn to beauty as a sense of freedom, but it's not individual freedom. It's a freedom of the whole. And we can be happy citizens in this, and we can be truly free in this. And I mean, again, that this is not something that, you know, people should just ultimately conclude at the end of this presentation, but think upon it as a hypothesis that if anyone has an idea of how they can contradict that, feel free to. Otherwise, you know, you have something to think about. Well, that's it.